I want to take you back in time to a strange moment in Hollywood history when some new studios, Netflix, Amazon, you may have heard of them, they were starting to release some prestigious titles that could really compete with just about anything at the Academy Awards. It was a time where some independent filmmakers, perhaps suspicious about the dissolution of cinema, but also deeply in need of finance, began to play ball with these new production companies and distributors. Yep, that time is now. Through the magic of time travel, we have arrived. If we could travel back in time to last week, you'd see that I reviewed the film The Hand of God, an incredible movie. And conveniently, I left out the part where that movie was paid for by Netflix. To be honest, I forgot. This week, we have another acclaimed director, this time Lynne Ramsay, crossing a certain pretentious person's picket line to work with one of these dreaded internet companies. This time, it's Amazon. Now, to be honest, I don't want to be too dramatic here. It's hard to make movies. It's hard to get people to pay you to make movies. It's hard to finance them. The fact that Amazon distributed a film doesn't necessarily say much about the movie itself or how it was developed, what it's about, why it is the way it is. It's probably not correct that Netflix and Amazon only care about money. It's possible that they are good for art house cinema. I'm not going to make this too political because it's a really complicated story, a story for its own video, and also because that probably wouldn't be fair to this movie. You were never really here. That said, when we get into this movie, I'm not going to make the review all about this, but when we get into the movie, I just think it's worth keeping in mind the circumstances of its production a little bit, because it does seem to be reflected to some extent in the movie itself, and it's an interesting thing to think about. I am not super familiar with Lynne Ramsay. I saw Ratcatcher a while ago, and I don't remember it. Like I said, an acclaimed director. This movie, you wonder if it's maybe aimed a little bit more at a mainstream audience from day one than some of her past work. We'll come back to that question. This movie stars Joaquin Phoenix as Joe, some kind of former military guy who lives in New York and takes care of things. You might call him a fixer. You might call him a thug. It seems like he mainly recovers minors who are being trafficked. He does this by any means necessary. So in some ways, this might sound like an action movie, like this guy is going to go on a badass rampage and free all these captive children. The opening of the movie actually makes it seem more like CSI than anything else. But as we go on, we'll see that this is actually something quite different in some ways. For one thing, this character, Joe, isn't quite a badass, I guess. He has his moments, but mainly you would probably say that he's troubled. I'll get into this a little bit more. But for starters, Joaquin Phoenix is absolutely incredible in this movie. He really steals the headlines here. At the start of the film, Joe doesn't get a hero's welcome. In fact, it kind of seems like he might be the bad guy, the villain. We kick things off with some short but fairly compelling moments of violence, edited into a man cleaning up a hotel room. We don't see his face. He's got a hood up, and the camera can never quite get under it. It looks like he's trying to hide something. He starts for the lobby of the hotel, carrying a bloody garbage bag with a hammer in it. But the cops are there out in front of the hotel, so he doubles back and he goes around out the back way instead. On his way out, a guy attacks him, and Joe knocks him out. Like I said, it's not at all clear that this is going to be the good guy. In the beginning, it feels a bit like an episode of CSI, but an episode where this guy is going to be brought to justice. I guess in a way, maybe he is brought to justice, but perhaps not how you would expect. Joe is going to return to New York, and the movie will open up a bit to show us a bit more about his life. We see that he lives with his mother somewhere way out in Queens, I think. It's a tough environment for him in a lot of ways. It's humiliating for him to care for his elderly mother, to share a bathroom with her. There's also some sense of love. There is a real relationship there, but it's not easy. In some contexts, Joe might seem really fierce, really capable, really strong, but in his home life, it's kind of the opposite. we see him trying to suffocate himself in a plastic bag, maybe an attempt at suicide or maybe just a morbid habit, a way to both shut out the world and to try to really feel something for once. We see some flashbacks to some kind of military thing in a desert. We see some flashbacks to what seems to be a traumatic childhood, an abusive father. Joe takes his knife and drops it down to his foot, moving his foot out of the way just at the last second. Morbid little games, his only refuge from his home life, it seems. So there's a fair amount to talk about here. In some ways, this character who struggles at home but is empowered by some sort of brutal criminal or professional life, that's not really something that new, but Joaquin Phoenix really gives this role life, and I think the beginning of the movie is quite strong. This film uses flashbacks, which are easy to overdo, but these little moments that we jump back to don't end up being part of any big mystery. They don't end up being the key to anything. They're just part of a story of trauma, a long story that's carried through to Joe's everyday action. At this point, it's still not entirely obvious what Joe does, how upstanding he might be, but this becomes more and more clear. I mentioned that this movie is set in New York. Unfortunately, that means it's time for a long tangent in which I complain about the setting, or praise the setting, talk about New York. Lynne Ramsay's from Scotland. I think she's lived a lot of different places in her life. Likely she's lived in New York, I don't know, or been here at least. This isn't really going to feel like an iconic New York movie, though. Like I said, it mainly takes place in Queens. There's one location in Manhattan, actually very close to my apartment. I'm not saying that the New York movie should be set in Manhattan. I'm just saying that if you're expecting a tourist film, if you're expecting a movie with the Empire State Building and Times Square in it, this is not the one. Even if we account for this not being a Manhattan movie, and not being a movie that's going to take us to any of the bucket list places, I'm still on the fence about how this movie uses the city. I think Lynne Ramsay is often really focused on people on the periphery, people who live way out and who don't experience things like tourists, people who are trapped in cities or in towns. And I think this movie, it captures that to some extent. But I think it also is maybe missing some localness to it. Last week I said that The Hand of God was a movie that could have only been made by somebody from Naples, somebody who'd spent a lot of time there. This is not that. It feels a little bit generic in its locations. There's also an extent to which the geography in this film is a bit amorphous. We kind of drift from Queens to Manhattan to Westchester County. We get a glimpse of the trains, we get a glimpse of cars, and we drive a bit, but it's still really this disconnected space. I'm not sure if this is by design or not. If you want a counterexample, you could think of something like The Man in the Gray Flannel Suit, which I reviewed on this channel a while ago now, along with the film The Horse in the Gray Flannel Suit. That's a great doubleheader video. That movie's set in Connecticut, I think, and Manhattan as well, and it really kind of hammers home the idea that there's commuter rail that connects them. People go from one place to another. Look, it's the morning. He's getting on the train. Oh, he's riding the train. Oh, look, he's getting off the train. Oh, no, he's heading back home. Oh, he gets off the train coming back home. Here's his family, right? It really hammers home this certain logic. It introduces us to Connecticut in this prim bedroom community. It introduces us to Manhattan as this churning corporate place, you know? So there's all kinds of ways to build some kind of geographic logic into film. And here, we don't really have that. We're just sort of wandering through a wasteland, which is interesting. I think the last thing to say about the setting is that it's a very bleak portrait of New York. And to be honest, I resent that. You might not, but I do. I don't think it's quite accurate, but oh well. Obviously, plenty of movies show crimes. That doesn't mean that the settings are necessarily dangerous. And there are, believe it or not, some crimes committed in New York occasionally. So it's not unreasonable. But I think in showing this place as kind of a bleak wasteland, the movie misses some huge opportunities to show the communities that actually exist way out in Queens, for instance, the things that bring all kinds of people together. My experience is that when you go out into more working class areas of New York, you tend to see more connection, more community, and that's cool. But this movie is really just about seediness and loneliness. I don't know. Like I said, take it with a grain of salt. You're probably not going to resent it in the way that I do, and it's not a deal breaker for me. It's not a strong thing. It's just a little twinge, I guess. But I will say there is just an extent to which this, like I said, it's missing some localness or whatever. It feels a little generic. So I don't know. The setting is fine, but it feels like it's sort of interchangeable with some other Lynn Ramsey Blight locations, you know? Anyway, before too long, Joe is going to get a mission to go on. And here the movie flips back a bit from character study to action movie. We've got a handhold to grasp onto. I won't get into exactly what this mission is, what he's supposed to do, but it involves violence. The violence in this film is probably one of the first things that most critics are going to pick up on. It's one of the most obvious ways that this movie diverges from an action movie or a genre film. I've talked before about how a lot of movies stylize violence. I think Kingsman, that's the example I always give. When the violence starts, the music starts. It's supposed to look and feel cool. Very common. There are also movies where you might describe the violence as unflinching, where it's the opposite or something. Sometimes it could mean that this is over the top and gratuitous, but often it means that it's serious and sobering, right? Here, we have some interesting stylistic choices that don't quite fall into any of these categories, I guess. A lot of the violence is shown after the fact. I mentioned earlier how trauma is really at the center of this movie, and here we're often stumbling onto violence right after it has happened, seeing the aftermath. This isn't quite the whole story. There are some scenes where we see Joe beat people up, and some of them even have music. Usually these scenes are filmed in a somewhat chaotic way. The camera is flying around, not in a stylish Jason Bourne shaky camera kind of thing where you feel like you're punching along with the action, but more in you get the sense that the cameraman came to film it and then got a bit freaked out because there was a fight going on and accidentally filmed the ceiling. It's hard to see what's happening sometimes. Violence sort of as chaos, violence as trauma. So in some ways, this seems like a movie full of so-called serious violence or whatever. One interesting counterpoint to this is that Joe really likes his hammers. Hammers are his weapon of choice, and when he's picking out a hammer in the hardware store, you can just see a smile sneak onto his face. There's some piece of his identity wrapped up in the hammer and in this violence and in this vengeance, maybe. Of course, this is also a generally available weapon, doubling down on the idea that a lot of people and a lot of objects are leading double lives. So I think this takes us towards some questions about kind of the moral balance of this film. Let me first say that I've seen this movie described as a neo-noir in a number of places, and you can see how this lone wolf story, this anti-hero, this guy wandering through an urban wasteland plying his masculinity, that kind of sounds like noir. Personally, though, I think that's kind of a misleading characterization of the movie, mainly because the style of the film doesn't have much to do with noir. Now, I really don't care what genre you want to say this is. Some people might really feel like they're leveraging all their expertise to diagnose this as, yep, it's noir. Go ahead. My 2 cents. You might be disappointed if you're expecting this. The moral balance, it's what we're going to talk about. Like I said, we've got some heroic moments. Joe has some heroic moments. He also has some really lonely moments. There's also moments of panic, moments of mischief, moments of indecision, and just general miscellaneous moments as well. There are really a lot of layers to this character, but the thing that dominates the movie is probably the balance between these first two things. Moments where Joe is in control, where he's intense, and moments where he can't get a grip on the world. We see this from the very beginning, and we also see it at the very end, when one of Joe's biggest triumphs coincides with a shattering internal defeat. He's within sight of the trophy, but he also feels like he can't have nice things or something like that. Some deep sort of conflict there throughout the whole movie. Of course, remember that the movie itself also switches between a violent action film and a more contemplative character study. Kind of interesting. In some ways, though, this balance feels a little mechanical to me. Joe gets a few moments to ride off into the sunset, but the feeling is almost immediately snatched away from him. So we bounce back and forth quite a bit in this movie. And maybe this is how it goes for some people. Very extreme internal swings. So I think this more or less works. And there's so many other layers, and Joaquin Phoenix does so well that the character really is the reason to watch the movie. But like I said, it did feel to me a little bit mechanical at times. Even though this movie is gritty and has this complicated main character, it does feel a bit moralistic here and there as well. And I think that the subject matter is one of the things that drives this. It's very difficult to make a movie about sex trafficking of minors without taking up some kind of moral position. Now, I'm not saying that this is a mistake, very reasonable thing to do, but this would be a very different movie if the crime that Joe was fighting against was bank robbery. Joe himself commits crimes. He beats people up, nearly kills them. For us to have any character study of him, any reasonable, rational character study of him, it feels like there needs to be some kind of righteousness on his side. So he saves underage girls, he uncovers corruption. This kind of balances things out in some ways. This is fine, but again, it feels a little bit mechanical to me. One more thing here is that the girls who are trafficked in this film are underage, but they appear to be teenagers. Why did Lynn Ramsey choose to have victims on the older end of minors? Maybe it was easier for the production. Maybe it's more realistic. I'm not sure. Maybe they make for better victims, more relatable than really young children. In some ways, it might also soften the blow, change the focus more from perversion to power. I don't know. How would this movie be different if victims were 5-year-olds? I don't really want to think about that a whole lot, so I'll leave it as a question for the viewers at home. It did stick out to me a little bit, though, in watching the movie. One more thing I want to mention is that this movie has a fair amount of classic rock in it, not as some stylish piece of the soundtrack, but there's just a lot of music playing diegetically, like songs playing on the car radio. To me, this is invoking some kind of traditional, mainstream, vaguely orthodox American values. These are maybe comforting at times, but they're also linked into all these stories of trauma, of power. One of the songs that shows up twice in the movie is Angel Baby by Rosie and the Originals, a great song in my opinion, actually. Rosie Hamlin, the lead singer, was 15 when this song was recorded, which is kind of an interesting little connection. I like how the song is used in the movie, but I think that overall this classic rock stuff felt a little off. It felt like a playlist made by somebody who isn't from around here. To me, it really doesn't seem like the soundtrack of New York, I guess. Okay, like I said, this film's production circumstances might explain some of the things we've talked about. This is a slightly mechanical moral balancing. There is a slightly mechanical moral balancing act, for instance, and that might have something to do with the pulpy source material that this film is adapted from. Lynn Ramsey has adapted a number of books. Why would she choose this one? I haven't read the original story. It's got the same name. That's where the name comes from. But my impression is that it's pulpy, simplistic in some ways. Maybe Ramsey saw it as the perfect backdrop for a more complex character study. Maybe it had elements of that character study in it already. Or maybe she saw it as an accessible plot that Amazon audiences could latch onto. In theory, this movie has something for everyone. It has action, suspense, a bit of politics, and it has depth. To some people, the best possible movie is one that appeals to a lot of people, but one that's also deeply meaningful. I mean, what more could you want? Personally, I think there is more to movies than just being, accessible, or even accessible and deep. But the real problem is that I can probably count on one hand the number of movies that really pull off being widely liked and also really challenging and interesting. Most of the time, people get tripped up trying to make something with general appeal and depth. This lands a lot of movies in identity crises. Now, I'm not going to make too firm an accusation here because I don't know what Lynn Ramsey's goal was. I don't know that it matters. But I think it's worth noting that you were never really here has 120,000 votes on IMDb, which is 10 times more than Ratcatcher, 10 times more than Morven Caller. It's rated 6.7. So if this movie was trying for general appeal, it was not successful. And it's not really a surprise. If you're just a normal person looking for a thriller and Amazon's algorithm serves you this, you will probably be disappointed. If you type this movie into Google, interestingly, one of the top suggestions is "You Were Never Really Here, Explained." There is really nothing in this movie that needs to be explained. But if you go into it thinking of it as some kind of clockwork thriller, you might think, I guess, that you're missing something. What about the other side of things, though? Does this movie succeed at something more sophisticated, I guess? Is it a good art house film or something like that? Well, I think it's fine. Probably nothing too special. And there are, like I said, a number of pieces that just feel a bit mechanical and a bit cheap. Maybe these are symptoms of trying to make the movie a bit more accessible. So I do think, to be honest, that this movie is trying to do too many things at once and is worse off because of that. But it had some highlights, without a doubt. Fairly engaging. Joaquin Phoenix really is good, probably the best thing about the movie. It's a good character study, plenty of layers, some ideas about trauma, some ideas about power, and our rickety internal lives.